Settle a little more deeply into whatever is supporting you, and allow the day to loosen its hold. Let your shoulders grow heavy, let your hands rest without purpose, and let each breath arrive in its own unhurried time. I'm the Yawning Historian. Tonight, we will travel gently into the world of learning in late Imperial China, beginning in a quiet courtyard before the first lesson and ending, much later, beside the soft glow of a scholar's lamp. The place we entered was not meant to stand for every school, every village, or every century of the long imperial past. It was a calm composite, assembled from patterns that records, paintings, family writings, and surviving buildings allowed us to glimpse, especially from the Ming and Qing periods. Schools varied greatly with region, wealth, local custom, and the ambitions of particular households. Some boys studied in a teacher's own room, some in a hall supported by a lineage or community, some at home with a relative or hired tutor, and some, if fortune and persistence carried them far enough, later entered academies devoted to more advanced study. For now, there was only a small courtyard under a sky that had not quite become morning. The paving stones held the coolness of night. A shallow sheen of moisture softened their gray surfaces, and the seams between them were dark with damp earth. Along one wall, the low-tiled roof descended in orderly rows, each tile catching a faint blue tone from the sky. The wooden doors were closed, yet they did not seem forbidding. They waited as doors had always waited, with worn thresholds and polished places where hands had pushed them open many times before. A bamboo broom leaned against the wall. Its thin twigs spread at the base like a quiet fan, and when the caretaker lifted it, the courtyard received the slow, dry whisper of sweeping. Dust, fallen leaves, and scraps of straw moved together in a patient line. The sound was gentle enough to belong to the hour. It passed over stone, paused at the edge of a step, and continued beneath the shadow of the eaves. Nothing hurried the broom. There was time to clear one corner, and then another, time for the air to brighten by a shade almost too small to notice. Near the door stood a covered water jar, its clay sides cool and slightly rough. Beside it rested a ladle, and near that, a basin that might be used for washing hands or adding water to an inkstone. Such details differed from place to place, and accounts rarely preserved every ordinary object in a modest learning room. Yet water, wood, paper, and stone formed the quiet material world around study. Before a child pronounced a line from an old text, someone had opened a shutter, swept a floor, carried water, repaired a stool, or made room on a table. The schoolroom itself was plain. The scene did not require a universal arrangement, because no such arrangement governed the countless private and household schools scattered across the empire. In this imagined room, narrow tables stood in two uneven rows. A few stools showed the shine of long use. A taller table waited near the front, with a chair behind it, and a small stack of books at one side. Shelves occupied part of the rear wall, not crowded like a grand library, but sufficient to hold several stitched volumes, loose practice sheets, a wrapped brush, and an old wooden box whose contents remained quietly ordinary. The air carried the mild scent of timber, cold ash, and paper. Paper had its own presence, especially when stored in a room that breathed with the seasons. Some sheets were smooth and pale, while others were more fibrous, less even, or already marked by practice. The exact paper available to a school depended on means and place. It could be precious enough to encourage care, and students might practice in ways that conserved materials, using copybooks, reused surfaces, or other economical arrangements when needed. The room therefore held not a limitless supply, but a modest collection shaped by household decisions. Beyond the wall, the settlement began to stir. A gate moved on its hinge. Somewhere farther away, a wooden bucket touched the rim of a well. A rooster announced itself once, and then seemed to reconsider the usefulness of further effort. The sounds did not arrive as a dramatic awakening. They appeared one by one, spaced by quiet, while the courtyard remained mostly blue and the roofline stood dark against the slowly paling east. The first pupil approached along a lane between walls and low houses. He was one possible pupil among many, not a portrait of every child. His family had found a way to spare some of his time for learning, at least for this season of his life. That decision may have reflected hope, local custom, a teacher nearby, the assistance of relatives, or the belief that even limited literacy could be useful. It also rested on labor performed by other members of the household, for time spent with books was time not spent carrying fuel, tending an animal, watching a younger child, or helping in a shop or field. He carried a small cloth bundle. Inside were a brush, a copybook, and perhaps a little food for later, though such arrangements varied too widely to be described as a rule. His steps were careful on the damp stones of the lane. The night air still rested in the folds of his clothing. When he reached the entrance, he paused only long enough to adjust the bundle, then crossed the threshold and entered the courtyard where the last leaves had just been swept aside. Another child arrived, then another, with intervals of silence between them. They were not all the same age, and many small schools could contain learners at different stages. One practiced the first shapes of characters, while another recited passages that had become familiar through repetition. A teacher working in such a setting might attend to one pupil, then another, setting an example to copy or a line to learn. The shared room could therefore hold several kinds of study at once, layered together in a soft mixture of murmured voices, brush sounds, and waiting. No bell rang across this courtyard in our composite morning. In some institutions, signals and schedules might have been more formal, while household study could follow rhythms fitted around family work. Surviving evidence did not justify giving every school one precise starting hour or one identical calendar. Lessons bent around seasons, festivals, agricultural demands, local expectations, and a family's changing resources. The late imperial landscape of learning was made from many arrangements, some stable and ambitious, some temporary, informal, or interrupted. The pupils entered the room and placed their things on the tables. Cloth unwrapped with a faint rustle. A wooden object touched the tabletop. Sleeves brushed over edges worn smooth by earlier hands. There was no need to hurry into the lesson. First came the small work of becoming settled, finding the right page, straightening a sheet, and making space for an inkstone. These motions formed a threshold of their own, a passage from the tasks and voices of home into the ordered attention expected in a room devoted to texts. For many students, the earliest curriculum centered on recognizing characters, learning model lines, and becoming familiar with texts that led toward the Confucian classics. The route was not identical everywhere, and the selection of primers, commentaries, and methods changed across time and circumstance. Still, many schools treated memorization and repeated reading as foundations. A line could be spoken, heard, repeated, and slowly made familiar until its rhythm rested in memory. Meaning might be explained in stages, according to the learner's age, the teacher's approach, and the purpose of the study. The prestige of the classics extended far beyond this small room. For families connected to literati culture, the books carried moral, social, and practical weight. They offered a language for discussing conduct, family relations, government, history, and cultivated judgment. They also stood at the center of the examination tradition that shaped elite education. Yet the influence of that tradition did not mean that every child in a village prepared directly for official examinations, or that every student remained in school long enough to approach them. Most children in the empire lived within households that depended upon their work. Schooling required time, materials, access to a teacher, and the continued support of adults. These conditions were distributed unevenly. A boy might attend for a period and then leave when work called him elsewhere. Another might study only enough to gain practical familiarity with written forms. A smaller number continued through years of demanding reading, writing, commentary, and preparation, supported by resources that many families could not sustain. Girls generally faced narrower educational opportunities, but their experiences were not absent from the historical landscape. In some families, girls learned to read at home, studied moral texts, wrote poetry, managed household accounts, or received instruction from relatives. Literate women left writings that made their presence unmistakable, even though institutions and examination pathways favored men. The quiet courtyard of our journey, therefore, represented one common male-centered setting without pretending that learning belonged only to the boys who crossed its stones. As the pupils waited, the sky above the courtyard shifted from deep blue to a softened gray. The tiles emerged more clearly. Their curved edges made alternating lines of light and shadow, and a few drops of moisture gathered at the lowest points before falling. One drop touched the stone near the water jar. Another rested beneath the eaves. Morning arrived by accumulation, not announcement, filling the small enclosed space a little at a time. The teacher had not yet taken his place. Perhaps he occupied a room just beyond the inner door, reviewing a passage or warming his hands around a cup. Perhaps he had walked from a nearby house. Teachers in private and community settings came from varied backgrounds. Some were accomplished scholars. Some had pursued examinations without reaching high office. Some were locally respected for their literacy, and some taught as one part of a life composed of family duties, writing, clerical work, and uncertain income. The title of teacher carried respect, though individual circumstances could be modest. His table held the visual center of the room without being grand. The wood had darkened at the corners. An inkstone rested on a small mat, and beside it lay a brush with its hairs gathered to a point. The books were bound in the stitched form familiar across much of late imperial book culture, with flexible covers and pages folded at the outer edge. Not every village room possessed the same editions or the same number of volumes. Books could be copied, borrowed, inherited, purchased, or shared, and their availability shaped what could be taught. The children kept their voices low. One traced a finger over a character in a copybook without touching the inked surface. The motion began at the upper part of the form, moved downward, turned, and stopped. Another child watched for a moment, then returned to his own page. The forms before them were more than pictures, yet at an early stage they could still seem like landscapes made from balanced strokes, each one asking the hand to remember direction, pressure, and proportion. Outside, footsteps passed the school wall and continued toward the busier lane. A shoulder pole creaked softly under its load. A dog shifted near a doorway and settled again. The world of labor was already moving, and the room of books existed within it, not apart from it. Cloth, food, lamp oil, brushes, ink, and paper all came through networks of work. The opportunity to sit at a table rested on countless practical acts that histories of education did not always record. The students' clothing reflected weather, household means, and local habit rather than a single school uniform. Sleeves might be patched. A cuff might show careful mending. A padded layer in colder months could make the body look rounder and the movement slower. In warm weather, open shutters and lighter cloth would change the room entirely. Our morning belonged to a cool season, chosen for its quiet air and the soft comfort of imagining hands gradually warming around an inkstone. One pupil opened the wooden shutters. The panel turned inward, and a pale rectangle of daylight entered the room. It crossed the floor and reached the leg of a table, revealing dust that had escaped the broom and now floated without urgency. The courtyard beyond became a framed view of wet stone, clay jar, and simple wall. Learning would take place beside that view, while clouds moved overhead and the day continued beyond the threshold. The room did not promise easy advancement. Later stories would follow the long shadow cast by the examinations, but even here, before the first recitation, it was worth keeping the promise in proportion. The examination system could offer prestige and official opportunity to those who succeeded, and stories of ascent held powerful appeal. At the same time, preparation demanded years, success was rare, and unequal resources shaped who could persist. The first lines learned in a small school did not automatically lead to the examination compound or an official robe. Still, the act of learning carried meaning beyond that distant path. A child able to recognize common characters might better navigate contracts, letters, genealogies, accounts, religious texts, or the written notices that appeared in local life. The exact practical reach of literacy varied, and reading skill did not always match writing skill. Some people recognized useful forms without mastering the classical curriculum. Education existed along a broad and uneven range, not as a simple division between the fully learned and everyone else. The composite courtyard allowed these different possibilities to remain together. One pupil might leave after a short period of study. Another might continue under a relative's supervision. One might discover pleasure in the steady order of characters. Another might remember mainly the cold edge of the table and the effort of keeping his place during recitation. The archive preserved only fragments of such ordinary experiences, so our journey remained gentle about what could be known and what had to be imagined from plausible details. At last, the inner door moved. The teacher entered without ceremony, carrying a book and a small covered cup. The pupils rose, their stools making subdued sounds against the floor. Greetings passed through the room in a respectful murmur. Formal courtesies mattered in an educational culture that connected learning with cultivated conduct, though their exact form varied. Soon everyone settled again, and the room returned to stillness, now shaped by a shared expectation. The teacher placed the book on his table. He adjusted its position until it rested squarely before him. Then he uncovered the cup, and a thread of steam rose into the cool air. It bent toward the open window and disappeared. For a few breaths, he simply looked around the room, seeing which pupils had arrived, which pages lay open, and which small faces still carried the softness of early morning. The first sound of the lesson was not yet a recited line. It was the sound of water being poured. A little stream entered the hollow of the inkstone, clear at first, then waiting for the dark ink stick that would turn it slowly black. The motion connected the room to a long culture of brush and text, but it also remained wonderfully ordinary. Water touched stone. A hand set down the ladle. A sleeve fell back into place. Across late Imperial China, written learning carried ideals of discipline, moral formation, family honor, and public service. Those ideals appeared in prefaces, essays, instructions, biographies, and examination culture. Daily practice, however, was shaped by tired bodies, limited means, individual temperaments, local teachers, and interruptions from the world outside. The distance between ideal and experience did not make the ideal unreal. It simply made the schoolroom human. The teacher opened the volume. The paper made a low, dry sound. He found the place marked from an earlier lesson and rested one finger beside the first column of characters. The students prepared to follow. Some already knew the cadence. Others watched his hand. In the courtyard, the bamboo broom had been returned to the wall, its work complete, and a bead of water still clung to the edge of a roof tile. The line was read aloud in an even voice. The pupils repeated it, not perfectly together, but close enough that separate voices became one mild current of sound. The words crossed the room, touched the wooden walls, and returned softened. Repetition began, and with it came the slow rhythm that would carry the morning forward, one phrase following another, one breath making space for the next. There was no need for us to master the lesson. We could remain near the open doorway, where the air from the courtyard met the warmer breath of the room. We could notice the brush resting beside the inkstone, the folded pages, the repaired cuff, and the pale morning spreading over the stones. The day of learning had begun without haste, and our journey had only settled into its first quiet room. For a while, the recitation continued, steady as the sweeping had been. The water jar waited beneath its cover. The last cool shadow withdrew beneath the eaves. And as the old lines passed gently from teacher to pupils, the courtyard grew calm enough to hold every sound, then calm enough to let each sound fade. The morning lesson had begun, but there was no hurry at all. We could leave the wider courtyard behind and draw a little closer to the surface of one wooden table, where the tools of writing waited in a loose, practical arrangement. Here the scale of history became very small. It narrowed to a few drops of water, the grain of an ink stick, the soft hairs of a brush, and the pale field of a page. These objects belonged to a long tradition, yet they did not appear in exactly the same form or quality in every household and school. Materials differed with region, period, craft, trade, and family means. A wealthy scholar might possess carefully chosen brushes, fine paper, and an admired inkstone, while a beginner in a modest school used simpler things, conserved every sheet, and learned from whatever examples were available. The common thread was not luxury, but the patient preparation required before a single dark mark could be made. On the table lay an inkstone with a shallow well. Its surface was cool, smooth in some places, and faintly textured in others. A little water had been added. The teacher or pupil held the inkstick upright and began to move it in slow circles, pressing gently enough to keep the motion controlled. Stone touched ink with a muted, sandy whisper. The clear water gradually clouded, first gray, then deeper, until a pool of black gathered beneath the moving hand. Grinding ink took time, and that time became part of the work. The wrist turned. The fingers maintained their hold. The small circle repeated itself without needing to become faster. Too much water could make the ink pale, while too little could leave it heavy, but skill arrived through practice rather than a single fixed formula. In our composite schoolroom, the pupil watched the change in color and learned to recognize when the liquid had reached a useful depth. The inkstick itself carried a faint scent of soot and binder. Fine inks could be objects of appreciation, shaped, impressed with designs, or kept carefully, though a school supply might be plainer and worn at the edge. Soot gathered from controlled burning had long provided the dark substance of ink, mixed and formed through crafts that stood far beyond the classroom. Every line on the page, therefore, began with other rooms and other hands, with fuel, smoke, molds, drying, trade, and transport, all compressed into this quiet black stick. Beside it rested the brush. Its handle was light, perhaps bamboo, perhaps another material available to its maker. The hairs came together in a flexible point when moistened and shaped. Brushes varied widely in size, stiffness, quality, and intended use, and no single type served every writer or every task. A young pupil needed only a serviceable tool and steady guidance, something that could hold ink and respond as the hand learned to lift, press, turn, and pause. The pupil dipped the tip into the newly ground ink. He did not bury the whole brush in the dark pool. He rotated it with care, letting the hairs take in liquid while preserving a point. A little excess touched the side of the stone. Then his hand moved across the table toward the practice sheet. That short journey, from stone to paper, held a quiet concentration all its own. Paper in late Imperial China had many textures and grades. Some kinds suited calligraphy, printing, letters, accounts, books, or everyday use better than others. The sheet before us was not named as though it represented them all. It was simply pale, slightly absorbent, and fibrous enough that the edge of a stroke softened when the brush paused. Light from the window passed over it, showing faint irregularities in the surface and a crease left from careful storage. Before writing, the pupil adjusted the sheet. A small weight at one edge helped keep it from shifting. The example lay nearby, its characters arranged in measured relation. Copying was a central practice in many paths of education. The beginner observed a form, repeated it, compared the result, and returned to it again. The task trained recognition and memory, but it also trained posture, movement, and attention, binding the learned character to the motion of the body. The first stroke descended. It began with the brush touching lightly, then pressing enough to widen the line before lifting away. The wetting shone for a moment. As it dried, the sheen dulled into a calm black. The next stroke crossed it. A third balanced the form. The character was imperfect, perhaps slightly crowded on one side, yet it had emerged from several deliberate choices, each one visible. The teacher did not need to announce failure. He could point to the model, indicate a proportion, or make a clearer version beside the pupil's attempt. Methods varied among teachers, and surviving prescriptions often described ideals more readily than every ordinary exchange. In our quiet room, correction remained measured. The teacher's brush moved once, showing a line that began firmly and ended with a controlled lift, then returned to rest. Around them, other pupils practiced at different stages. One repeated basic forms in generous spaces. Another copied a line from a primer. A more experienced student worked through a familiar passage whose cadence had already entered his memory. Their brushes did not move together. One paused while another wrote, and the room filled with tiny irregular sounds. The touch of a handle against stone, the slip of cloth over wood, the dry turning of a page. Many schools placed repeated reading and memorization near the center of early study, especially for boys whose education followed the classical tradition. Primers could introduce characters, moral language, historical examples, and ordered phrases. Later work might lead into texts associated with the Confucian canon and the commentarial traditions through which those texts were understood. The route was not uniform, and choices changed over the centuries, but the gravity of classical learning was strong in many educational settings. Writing a line and reciting it could support one another. The eye met the form, the mouth carried the sound, the ear received the cadence, and the hand traced the sequence of strokes. A pupil might know a passage by voice before grasping its fuller meaning. Explanation could unfold later, layer by layer. Modern distinctions between memorizing and understanding did not always describe the older classroom neatly, for repetition could be treated as the ground upon which interpretation would eventually stand. That ground was built slowly. The pupil copied the same character again, leaving a small interval of white space. His second version leaned less than the first. The third held its horizontal line more steadily. The fourth carried too much ink and spread at one corner. He waited for it to dry rather than touching it. A small error could remain on the page without becoming an event. It simply joined the record of practice. Paper encouraged care because it represented labor and cost. The degree of scarcity varied enormously, and one should not imagine every student rationing identical sheets in identical ways. Still, economical practice was sensible in many households and schools. Learners might use less costly paper, copy within ruled spaces, work from durable models, or find ways to extend the usefulness of a surface. Printed books themselves could be shared, inherited, or handled with attention so they would survive many readings. The development of woodblock printing had made texts more available than they had been in much earlier eras, and late imperial commercial publishing produced a rich world of books. Availability, however, was never the same as equal access. Books had to be purchased, borrowed, copied, or supplied by someone. Rural distance, family income, local markets, and social networks all mattered. A school shelf with only a few volumes could still connect its pupils to texts copied and printed across generations. One stitched book lay open near the teacher. Its pages had been printed in vertical columns. The folded leaves were bound along one side, and the outer edges had softened from use. A page corner bore the faint shadow of many fingers. The teacher turned it from the edge with a practiced motion, careful not to drag wet ink across the paper. The book settled with the slightest breath of trapped air. Printed models gave stability to a text, while handwriting placed that text back into the varied motions of individual people. No two pupils held a brush in precisely the same way. No two lines carried exactly the same pressure. Calligraphy could become an elevated art and a sign of cultivation, but a beginner first faced simpler concerns. The brush had to remain upright enough to respond. The arm had to move without crushing the hairs. The hand had to learn that a line possessed a beginning, a body, and an end. The teacher demonstrated another character. He placed the brush, pressed, turned, and drew it inward. His motion appeared calm because years had removed much visible uncertainty. The pupil watched the brush rather than the finished form. This mattered because the final black shape concealed the sequence that produced it. By observing movement, the child learned how stillness on paper had grown from motion in the air. Outside the window, the courtyard had brightened. The water jar showed a warmer band of color along one side. Someone passing beneath the eaves cast a shadow that moved across the open shutter and disappeared. The writing table remained in gentle light, bright enough to reveal the paper, but not so strong that every surface shone. The room had found its daytime balance. Ink dried differently according to paper, mixture, weather, and the amount carried by the brush. On a damp morning, a heavy stroke could remain glossy a little longer. On a dry day, the point might begin to drag sooner. The learner adapted without needing a scientific explanation. He noticed how the brush felt. He added water when the mixture thickened. He learned not from a timetable measured to the minute, but from repeated contact with materials. A small cloth rested near the stone. It carried old shadows where ink had been wiped away. The stain had spread into soft-edged clouds, layered through many sessions until no single mark could be separated from the others. Such humble objects rarely entered formal accounts of scholarship, yet they belonged to the physical truth of writing. Brushes dripped. Fingers darkened. Water spilled. Tables acquired marks that no amount of wiping entirely removed. One pupil had a faint stain on the side of his finger. He looked at it, rubbed it against the cloth, and returned to his work. Another pupil's brush had lost its point, so he shaped it gently against the inkstone. Their concentration came and went like daylight under passing clouds. A face lifted toward a sound in the lane, then lowered again. Attention did not need to be perfect to become habitual. The characters they copied carried older voices. Classical phrases had passed through commentaries, editions, family libraries, schools, academies, and examination halls. Yet in this room, the inheritance arrived in pieces small enough for a child to hold. One line was spoken, one form was copied, one page was filled. The magnitude of tradition rested on ordinary repetitions that left little trace beyond the worn book and the trained memory. Some pupils would move further into this textual world. They might read layers of commentary, compose regulated forms, study historical models, and practice the demanding styles connected with examinations. Others would not remain long enough. The brush skills gained here might later serve a shop, a household, a lineage office, a letter, or a personal pleasure. Educational paths branched quietly, shaped by ability and desire, but also by money, kinship, labor, gender, geography, and chance. The material tools did not erase those differences. A brush could seem simple, but it required purchase or making. Ink had to be replenished. Paper disappeared sheet by sheet. A teacher needed support. The ideal of diligent study often concealed a household calculation beneath it, renewed with each season. When resources tightened, lessons could pause. When work increased, a child could be called away. The page before us remained peaceful because others had made room for it. At the neighboring table, an older pupil recited softly while copying. His voice followed the column of text in a low, even pulse. He was not performing for an audience. The sound helped keep his place and fasten the sequence in memory. Several voices elsewhere in the room did the same, each at a different point, creating a gentle weave of phrases that overlapped without quite becoming confusion. The teacher moved among the tables. His robe brushed the back of a stool. He stopped beside one page, looked, and tapped lightly near a crowded stroke. He waited while the pupil tried again. The correction entered the flow of the morning and passed. There was no dramatic triumph in the improved character, only a small increase in balance that the child might remember when the same form appeared tomorrow. Practice sheets accumulated at the side of the table. Some lines were dark and confident. Others faded where the ink had thinned. A few characters tilted or spread beyond their intended space. Together they showed time made visible. The pile did not tell us how quickly a particular pupil learned, and no surviving rule could make every childhood identical. It simply showed that writing asked for return, for the hand to meet the same movements again and again. When the inkstone's well grew shallow, a little water was added. The fresh drop sat bright on the black surface before the inkstick moved through it. Gray swirls turned beneath the hand, widening and darkening. The sound of grinding returned, soft enough to calm the room. It was work, but work with a circular rhythm, requiring neither surprise nor speed. The tradition sometimes described writing tools with language of companionship and refinement. In cultivated settings, brush, ink, paper, and inkstone could be appreciated as treasures of the scholar's room. Our school table held their quieter cousins. The brush was used, the inkstone modest, the paper carefully counted. Even so, each tool invited attention. Their beauty came from usefulness, from the simple fact that thought could pass through the moving hand and remain as a mark. Near midday, the window light reached farther across the floor. The wet characters on the newest sheet changed from reflective black to a softer matte tone. The pupil lifted the page by its edges and placed it aside. Beneath it, the table bore a dark spot from some earlier lesson, absorbed deep into the wood. He laid down a clean sheet and aligned it with the weight. The blank sheet carried its own lesson before any ink touched it. Characters written in columns had to occupy space in relation to one another, neither drifting too far apart nor pressing into an unreadable cluster. Copying trained the eye to notice margins, intervals, and the quiet architecture of a page. In more advanced work, layout could follow established conventions suited to letters, essays, books, or examination writing. For this beginner, it was enough to see that every form needed room to breathe. He followed a faint guide that divided the practice area into manageable spaces. Such aids could take different forms, and many learners practiced under conditions that the record did not describe in detail. The principle was simple. A bounded space gave the hand somewhere to begin and end. Within it, the pupil learned to place a small world of strokes, to judge the weight of one side against the other, and to leave the surrounding paper undisturbed. Even posture belonged to the material lesson. The child sat upright for a while, then gradually leaned closer until the teacher's passing hand reminded him to lift his head. His elbow shifted. His feet found the rung beneath the stool. Ideals of composed bearing were easier to state than to maintain through a long morning, especially for young bodies. The room quietly accommodated this difference between instruction and experience, between the balanced figure described by a teacher and the restless pupil who returned to balance many times. At the far end of the table, a finished practice page had begun to curl as it dried. A small weight held one corner. The marks were not preserved as a treasure, and they might later be discarded, reused in some practical way, or kept briefly for comparison. Their destination mattered less than the discipline they recorded. Each sheet absorbed a portion of the morning, then yielded its place to the next. This time, before dipping the brush, he studied the model for several breaths. His gaze traveled through the order of strokes. The room continued around him, full of murmured text and turning pages, but the character before him seemed to become spacious. He lifted the brush. The tip darkened. His sleeve shifted back from his wrist. The first stroke landed more gently than before. It moved with a little more confidence, not because the lesson had reached a conclusion, but because repetition had made one motion familiar. The next stroke followed, then another. The character took shape within its patch of pale paper, balanced well enough for the teacher to pass without pausing. Soon the brush returned to the inkstone. A thread of ink gathered near its tip and settled. The pupil released his fingers, flexed them once, and rested his hand beside the page. All around him, the tools grew still for a moment. Paper lay flat. Water darkened stone. Brushes waited across their rests. The lesson would continue, as lessons often did, through modest cycles of effort and pause. Yet we could remain with the quiet interval between two lines. The page held the marks already made and asked for nothing more. The pale fibers received the window light. The black ink slowly dried, and the faint scent of soot lingered close to the table. There was no hurry to fill the empty space. Another breath passed through the room. Another soft page turned, and beneath the open window, the inkstone kept its small dark pool, smooth and calm as water at night. The ink had dried. The brushes had been set across their rests, and the room eased into another kind of attention. There was no hurry at all as we moved from the pupils' tables toward the taller table near the front. Here sat the master, with an open book, a covered cup, and a narrow view through the window toward the damp courtyard. His voice would shape the next part of the morning, not as a sudden performance, but as a steady line that the students could follow. The figure at this table was another careful composite. Teachers in late Imperial China did not form one uniform profession with identical training, income, duties, or status. Many schools were private arrangements supported by families, communities, or lineages, and teaching could take place in homes, ancestral halls, rented rooms, or spaces maintained for learning. Some masters were degree holders or men who had prepared for examinations. Others were locally educated scholars whose knowledge and reputation made them suitable guides for younger pupils. The man before us had spent many years among books, though the exact shape of his earlier ambitions remained unstated. Perhaps he had once traveled to an examination and returned without the result his family hoped for. Perhaps he had never advanced far along that path. Perhaps teaching suited his circumstances more than official aspiration. Such possibilities appeared often enough in the broad world of local education, but no single biography could stand for all. We knew only what the quiet table showed: a practiced hand, a familiar text, and the patience to hear the same line repeated many times. His clothing was clean and subdued, mended so carefully at one inner seam that the repair disappeared when his sleeve rested on the table. A soft cap covered his hair. Beside the book lay a small slip of paper marked with notes. The furnishings did not proclaim wealth. Respect in the room came from his role, his learning, his age, and the expectations that pupils carried across the threshold, though respect, like every human relationship, varied in depth from one school to another. Teaching provided a livelihood, but it was not always a secure one. Arrangements for support differed widely and could include payments, gifts, food, lodging, or assistance organized by several households. The evidence did not support assigning one standard fee or one annual contract to this school. A teacher's means depended on the place, the number and resources of pupils, his connections, and whatever other work he performed. The modest cup and worn table fit a life sustained by several small streams rather than a grand institutional salary. He raised the open book slightly and read the line before him. His voice was clear but not loud. The students repeated it. The response arrived unevenly, with one child entering too early and another drawing out the final sound, but the master allowed the cadence to settle through another repetition. The second attempt held together more smoothly. By the third, the phrase crossed the room like a slow wave and faded near the shelves. Oral reading made the classroom audible. In many traditional settings, texts were learned through recitation as well as silent attention. A pupil's voice revealed whether he remembered the sequence and could follow the expected phrasing. Several pupils studying different passages might create a room full of overlapping sound. Prescriptive writings could praise diligence and order, yet daily recitation surely included hesitation, wandering attention, dry throats, forgotten words, and the ordinary adjustments of teaching. The master listened for a missing phrase. When one pupil paused, he supplied the beginning of the next line in a lower voice. The child found his place and continued. No drama gathered around the lapse. Memory returned through a prompt, and the recitation flowed onward. The teacher's task was not merely to possess a text, but to notice the precise point where another mind had lost its path and offer enough guidance for the path to reappear. Memorization held an important place in classical education. From a later perspective, Repeated recitation could appear narrow if separated from everything that followed. Within the tradition, however, committing passages to memory could create a store of language for later explanation, comparison, composition, and moral reflection. Many schools expected learners to become deeply familiar with foundational texts, though the age, pace, order, and degree of interpretation varied among teachers and pupils. At an early stage, a child might repeat words whose full implications remained beyond him. This was not necessarily treated as a flaw. Meaning could unfold over years, helped by commentary and discussion. The line first entered as sound, then as recognizable written forms, then as an object of explanation. Later still, it might become material for an essay, an argument, an official ideal, a family instruction, or a private doubt. Texts remained the same on the page while readers changed around them. The master placed one finger beside a character and offered a brief explanation. He spoke of proper conduct within a relationship, using an example simple enough for a child to recognize. Confucian learning was often described as moral cultivation rather than the collection of information alone. Reading, ritual conduct, disciplined habits, and reflection were linked in the ideal of forming a person capable of acting responsibly within family and society. The classroom carried that ideal, even when its daily reality was more uneven. Ideals appeared polished in educational writings. A diligent pupil rose to study, respected elders, controlled distractions, and advanced through steady effort. A worthy teacher combined learning, upright conduct, and careful guidance. Real rooms contained incomplete versions of those figures. A teacher could be tired or worried about money. A pupil could be dutiful one day and absent the next because his labor was needed. Lessons could be shortened by weather, illness, travel, family ceremonies, or agricultural work. Our master understood this gap without giving it a name. One stool stood empty near the wall. The boy who used it had remained at home to help with a household task, or so another pupil had quietly reported. The teacher glanced at the empty place and then continued. An absent child was neither a symbol nor a scandal. He was part of a family economy whose demands entered the schoolroom even when he did not. The next pupil approached the master's table with a copybook. He held it in both hands and placed it carefully beside the open volume. The teacher read the page from top to bottom. His gaze moved more slowly over one crowded character. He took up his brush, added a small mark near the edge, and demonstrated the form on a spare strip of paper. Then he returned the book. The exchange lasted less than a minute, yet it carried the concentrated attention of individual instruction. Small schools often required a master to manage pupils at different levels. While one child recited, another copied. While an older student received an explanation, a beginner repeated a form. The teacher's attention traveled around the room rather than arriving through one lesson delivered equally to all. This arrangement could look informal, though it depended on habits strong enough to keep several learners occupied while the master sat with one. The older student now opened a commentary. Commentaries were central to the learned tradition because classical lines did not stand alone. Generations of scholars had interpreted wording, clarified references, arranged accepted readings, and debated implications. In the curriculum associated with examinations, influential commentarial frameworks shaped how canonical texts were understood. Yet the books available and the sophistication of instruction differed greatly between an advanced academy and a modest local room. The master read a short passage from the commentary and paraphrased it. He did not turn the moment into a display of remote erudition. He connected the explanation to the line already memorized, adding one layer and then stopping. Too much at once would have drifted beyond the student's grasp. Teaching often depended on measure. on knowing what could be carried now and what should wait until another season of study. The shelf behind him held only a portion of the textual world. Beyond this room lay histories, collected writings, dictionaries, model essays, poetry, ritual works, philosophical discussions, and practical books of many kinds. Commercial publishing had broadened the circulation of texts during the late imperial period, especially in active book markets, but circulation remained unequal. A teacher's personal collection could be precious precisely because it provided access that pupils' households might not possess. One volume had come to him from an older relative. Another had been copied in part during his own study. A printed edition bore the marks of previous readers, small circles, dots, and notes placed where attention had lingered. We did not need to invent the exact history of each book. Their worn covers were enough to suggest movement across hands and years, the quiet transmission through which local learning survived. The master turned toward the window while a pupil recited. Outside, the courtyard stones had nearly dried, except where the roof still cast shade. The bamboo broom remained against the wall. A bird landed on a tile, tilted its head, and departed without interrupting the room. The teacher's gaze returned to the text before the recitation reached its final line. His authority rested partly on command of such lines. It also rested on social expectations surrounding teachers and learning. Traditional formulations could place the teacher within a deeply respected moral order. In practice, relationships were shaped by personality, family ties, reputation, and local negotiation. Some pupils may have remembered kindness, others severity, and many a mixture too ordinary to survive in written accounts. Our story kept the atmosphere calm without claiming that every historical classroom had been gentle. Discipline existed in educational culture, and some sources described strict correction, but there was no need to make punishment the center of this room. The quieter discipline of repetition already filled the morning. A line forgotten had to be learned again. A page carelessly made had to be recopied. A restless child was guided back to his place. These small returns shaped the lesson more continuously than any dramatic moment could. The master lifted his cup. The steam had thinned, and the drink had cooled enough for a slow sip. For a moment, the pupils continued without him. Their voices held the familiar passage in a loose unison. He listened over the rim, then set the cup down upon its ring-shaped mark on the wood. The sound was barely more than a tap. The classical curriculum carried a long historical inheritance, but late imperial education was also responsive to the demands of its own time. Examination conventions influenced what ambitious students practiced, particularly as they advanced toward composition. Model forms, accepted interpretations, and disciplined prose mattered for those pursuing degrees. The shadow of that system could reach even an elementary room through the prestige of the books and the hopes of families. Still, the master did not look at every beginner and see a future official. He knew how few would continue that far. Some would return fully to farming, craft, trade, or household work. Some might use literacy in local affairs. Some would read letters or keep accounts. A small number might become teachers themselves. The same opening lesson could lead into many adult lives, most of them outside formal office. This knowledge may have softened the practical purpose of his work without diminishing it. Teaching a child to read a basic text was worthwhile even if the examination road never opened. The ability to recognize written language could carry dignity, usefulness, and connection to family tradition. It could also remain partial. Historical literacy was not one smooth ladder, and individuals occupied many points between knowing a few characters and mastering demanding classical prose. A younger pupil began another recitation. His voice was high and careful. He placed a slight pause after each short unit. following the rhythm the master had modeled. The teacher corrected one sound, and the child repeated it. Outside the door, someone crossed the courtyard carrying the water ladle. Light flashed briefly along its wet edge and vanished. The master asked the pupil to begin again, not as a rebuke, but because beginning again was the work. The familiar first words returned. This time the difficult sounds settled more naturally into the phrase. The teacher nodded once. The pupil continued, shoulders gradually lowering as memory took over and allowed effort to become rhythm. At another table, the older student considered the commentary. He copied a short note beside his main text, using smaller characters. The note connected a phrase to an explanation he would need to remember. Later study might ask him to draw together multiple passages and compose within highly regulated expectations. For now, the small annotation was enough, a bridge between the master's spoken words and the page he could revisit. Teaching itself relied on memory. The master knew passages well enough to detect omissions while also attending to other sounds in the room. He remembered which pupil struggled with a particular form, which one rushed, and which one needed a quieter prompt. These details were not preserved in official histories, but they belonged to the craft of instruction. A classroom became workable through accumulated knowledge of learners, not through texts alone. The master's day likely extended beyond the visible lesson. He prepared examples, considered passages, maintained books, spoke with families, and managed his own household concerns. If he still pursued study for examinations or personal cultivation, his private reading waited after the pupils left. The same lamp might illuminate a child's copybook by day and the teacher's own pages by night. Scholarship and livelihood met at his table, sometimes comfortably and sometimes with strain. For the moment, strain remained outside our frame. The room had entered the settled middle of its session. No one was arriving now. The first coolness had lifted from the floor. A mild warmth gathered where the sunlight touched the tables, and the scent of ink had blended with the faint smell rising from the teacher's cup. He closed one book and opened another. The stitched binding flexed. Its cover had faded toward gray at the edges. He found a page marked with a narrow slip and smoothed it with the side of his hand. This text contained a passage suited to the older pupil, while the younger children continued copying. The room shifted to accommodate the change without becoming silent. The master read, paused, and explained. His voice rose only enough to remain clear above the low recitations. He traced a relationship between two lines, then placed them within a moral example familiar to the tradition. We did not need to accept every ideal as a transparent picture of society. Instruction often expressed the order people hoped to cultivate, while households and communities remained complicated, unequal, affectionate, demanding, and alive. The student listened and then repeated the explanation in simpler words. The master adjusted one point. A brief silence followed while both looked down at the same column of text. Teacher and pupil were separated by age and authority, yet their attention met upon the page. The old characters held them there, one guiding, one learning, while dust turned slowly in the window light. Across the empire, countless exchanges of this kind disappeared as soon as they occurred. Records were more likely to preserve famous academies, noted scholars, educational ideals, successful candidates, or family instructions than an ordinary correction in a modest school. The missing detail asked us to remain humble. We could describe patterns, materials, and institutions, but the exact tone of any lost voice rested beyond recovery. Our imagined master's voice therefore stayed low. It carried no grand prophecy and promised no certain assent. It simply gave shape to a morning of reading. He listened, corrected, explained, and waited. His pupils answered with varying confidence. The work advanced by inches, measured in lines remembered and strokes made more balanced than before. Near the end of the lesson, he returned to the passage the whole room shared. The pupils set aside their individual tasks. Brushes came to rest. Pages remained open to dry. The master read the first line, and the response followed. Then came the next, and another, each phrase gathering the scattered attention of the room into one calm cadence. The sound passed through the open window and into the courtyard. It mingled with the faint creak of bamboo, the movement of air beneath the eaves, and footsteps fading along the lane. For a few minutes, teacher and pupils inhabited the same measured rhythm. No one needed to know where each educational path would end. When the final line faded, the master lowered his book. He did not close it at once. His hand rested on the page, keeping the place, while the room held the quiet left behind by many voices. A pupil breathed out. A stool shifted softly. Somewhere beyond the wall, a pot lid settled against clay. The books would remain on the table for the next lesson. The master's cup had grown cool. Sunlight touched the lower shelf and stopped just short of the wall. In that gentle pause, teaching seemed less like a speech and more like tending a small flame, protected from wind, passed carefully from one wick to another. We could leave the room as quietly as we had entered. Behind us, the master turned one page, and a pupil prepared to begin again. The voice that followed was soft, the window light was steady, and the old lines continued at an unhurried pace, growing fainter as the courtyard received us once more. The lesson had ended softly, not with a bell that rang across the village, but with the gradual closing of books, the settling of brushes, and the master's quiet permission to rise. In our imagined schoolroom, which gathered details from many late imperial settings rather than copying one particular place, the pupils stood from their benches and waited while the last damp characters rested on the paper. A faint odor of ink remained beside the warmer scents drifting in from nearby kitchens. Outside, daylight had filled the stone courtyard. The water jar that had seemed gray before dawn now held a small patch of pale sky, and the wooden doors cast narrow shadows across the threshold. There was no hurry at all. The world beyond the school had been waiting in its ordinary way, with baskets to carry, meals to share, animals to tend, and paths leading home between walls, gardens, fields, workshops, and market lanes. For many children in late Imperial China, learning could never have been separated completely from the work of the household. A family was not merely a place in which a child slept and ate. It was also an economy of hands, seasons, obligations, and careful choices. Grain had to be prepared, fuel gathered or purchased, cloth mended, tools cleaned, goods delivered, younger children watched, and older relatives assisted. The exact arrangement differed widely between a farming village, a market town, a merchant household, and the home of a local scholar. Yet across those differences, time spent at a desk was time that had to be made possible by someone. A pupil studying characters carried to school not only a book and brush, but also the quiet support of people whose own labor created a space for his lessons. The ideal image of schooling often placed study above ordinary concerns. Moral writings praised steady application, respect for teachers, attention to books, and the shaping of conduct through disciplined reading. In lived experience, However, a page might share the day with errands and interruptions. A boy could repeat a line from a primer in the morning and help with family work later on. He might attend lessons regularly for one part of the year and less regularly when the household needed him. In another family, an older child might have more freedom to study because younger siblings performed certain small tasks, or because adults had decided that his promise justified the sacrifice. Records and family accounts suggest many variations. No single daily arrangement can stand for the enormous range of homes and schools spread across the empire. Let us follow one pupil only as a gentle composite, not as a documented child with a fixed name and schedule. He stepped through the school doorway with a folded copybook protected inside his clothing or a simple wrapping. He had practiced until the muscles of his fingers felt the memory of the brush even after the brush had been put away. Before turning toward home, he may have been asked to carry something modest, perhaps a message for a relative, a small purchase, or an empty container to be filled. Such errands belong to the texture of ordinary life. They did not arrive as adventures. They were the slow threads by which a family connected its courtyard to a shop, a field, a neighbor, a shrine, or another branch of the household. Along the lane, the morning's recitation softened in his mind. A line once spoken with several voices became private and faint, matching the rhythm of his footsteps. Earthen walls held the warmth of the sun. Roof tiles overlapped in dark rows, though roofing materials differed by region and by means, and a patched thatch roof could stand not far from a more substantial tiled one. A chicken moved beneath a bench. Somewhere behind a wall, water sounded against a basin. The pupil walked around a cart resting in the shade and past a doorway where an artisan bent over quiet work. None of these details belong to every route. They simply allow us to feel how literacy was learned inside a larger landscape of manual skill, household exchange, and repeated daily movement. A meal waited in some homes, while in others it waited only after more work had been completed. It is safest not to imagine one universal bowl or menu. Diet depended on place, season, income, custom, and what a family could grow or buy. Yet warm grain, vegetables, preserved foods, and whatever else a household had prepared could make a humble center to the day. Steam rose, lids shifted, chopsticks touched bowls, and conversation stayed close to practical things. A child returning from lessons might eat with relatives, or at a different moment according to the household rhythm. The important part was not a precise dish. It was the warmth of food after stillness at the desk, and the way study returned to the same table where family resources were counted and shared. The price of learning was not limited to a payment made to a teacher, and arrangements for supporting teachers varied too much to reduce them to one fee. Paper had value. Ink had value. Brushes wore down. Texts could be purchased, borrowed, copied, inherited, or shared, depending on circumstance. Clothing and food had to be provided while a child spent time studying rather than producing something immediately useful. Travel could take part of a day. A household with secure income and scholarly connections could absorb these demands more easily than a family living near the edge of need. Even a very capable child might have found that talent did not manufacture hours, books, or warm meals. Opportunity depended upon resources, sponsorship, family judgment, local institutions, and chance. This did not mean that every poor child remained entirely outside written culture, nor that every wealthy child pursued long study. Such neat divisions would smooth away too much of the past. Some boys learned enough characters for practical purposes and then left formal lessons. Some received help from kin or patrons who recognized ability. Some learned in irregular ways from relatives, clerks, merchants, religious figures, or teachers whose arrangements were less formal than the schoolroom in our courtyard. Some prosperous families may have had children who disliked study or failed to advance. The surviving record often favors those who wrote, passed examinations, held office, kept genealogies, or left notable collections, while the brief educational lives of ordinary pupils can appear only in hints. For a household, basic literacy could have value even when the examination ladder stood far away. Written agreements, accounts, letters, labels, notices, genealogical records, and ritual texts all belong to worlds in which recognizing characters brought practical and social usefulness. Levels of literacy differed greatly. A person able to read familiar documents was not necessarily prepared to interpret the classical canon, compose formal essays, or write an elegant hand. The word literate can conceal a broad landscape of abilities. Our returning pupil might one day use his learning in a shop, a lineage office, a household account book, or private correspondence, without ever sitting for a high examination. The first lines copied at school could lead into many modest forms of competence. When he reached home, his brush hand could become an errand hand. He might set down his books, change his outer layer if dust or weather required it, and lift a small basket. In a rural setting, tasks could follow agricultural seasons. Seed, water, weeds, harvest, storage, and animals gave the year its own curriculum, one written in soil and weather rather than ink. In a town, work might gather around a shop counter, a workshop, deliveries, stock, or customers. A scholar's household had labor too, though it could be distributed among servants, relatives, and dependents in ways unavailable to a poor family. The same moral praise of diligence could therefore rest upon very unequal conditions. The child's walk might continue beyond his own gate. A basket swung lightly from his arm as he followed a track between fields, or a paved lane between crowded buildings, or a riverside path where boats moved with patient strokes. Geographic variety mattered. Northern wind, southern rain, mountain roads, canal towns, and dry inland routes did not offer the same sensory world. We are borrowing only a few quiet impressions. Dust gathered at the hem. Willow leaves turned their pale undersides. Water buffalo stood in the shallows in some regions, while elsewhere another landscape entirely framed the journey. Through all of it, the memorized phrases remained present, sometimes clear, sometimes slipping behind the immediate need to keep a jar steady. An older relative might ask for a line to be read, a name to be copied, or a simple account to be checked. This image should also be held lightly, since roles differed from home to home, but it reveals how learning could leave the schoolroom before the pupil had finished learning. A few written characters might serve the family that had paid for paper and surrendered hours of labor. The child leaned over a table, still inexperienced, and formed a character more slowly than a practiced clerk would have done. The result might not have been beautiful, yet the household could recognize a small return on its patience, not in rank or office, but in the useful crossing between spoken life and written marks. Other children on the lane had followed different days. Many boys did not remain in school for long, and many may never have entered a sustained course of study. Their work began earlier or occupied more of the day. They learned other exacting bodies of knowledge, often without books: when to open a sluice, how to judge cloth, how to sharpen a blade, how to remember a customer's debt, how to carry a sleeping infant, how to read weather in a change of wind. Such knowledge rarely received the prestige granted to classical learning, yet households depended on it. The scholar's page and the craftsperson's hand belonged to the same society, though honors and authority were distributed unevenly between them. Girls and women stood within this uneven landscape in ways that cannot be described by a single absence. Formal educational opportunities were generally much narrower for girls than for boys, and the examination path did not offer women the ordinary route to office that it offered a small minority of men. Ideals of gender, household roles, and family resources limited the time and instruction available to many. Still, some girls learned to read, and some learned to write with considerable skill, especially within families that valued female education or possessed books and scholarly connections. Instruction might occur at home through parents, brothers, other relatives, or hired teachers. Women's poems, letters, teachings, and other writings survive, even though they represent only part of a much larger and less visible range of experience. In our composite household, a sister could pause near the table after the pupil returned. It would be careless to assume that she had attended the same school, and equally careless to assume that she understood nothing on the page. Perhaps she recognized several characters from household instruction. Perhaps she had copied verses under a mother's guidance. Perhaps she had no opportunity at all and merely watched the ink dry. Each possibility existed somewhere, while none should be made universal. She lifted the lid from a food container, listened to the boy repeat a passage, and went on with her own work. The quiet scene held both connection and inequality, close together beneath the same roof. Education within a family could be imagined as an investment in virtue as well as utility. Confucian ideals associated learning with self-cultivation, proper relationships, and the ordering of household and state. A child was not simply gathering information. He was supposed to shape habits, speech, respect, and moral judgment. Yet ideals written in prefaces and family instructions do not prove that every pupil became patient, obedient, or wise. Children grew tired. Adults worried about costs. Teachers varied in ability. Households disagreed about priorities. The calm image of a boy reciting before an approving elder may have been true at times, while at other times the page remained unopened because work pressed more urgently. The afternoon settled into layers of sound. A knife tapped against a board. A loom or spinning tool made its small repeated movement in a household engaged in textile work. A seller called from farther down the street, the words thinning as distance increased. From a nearby room came the murmur of someone reading aloud. Reading aloud and memorized recitation could carry texts beyond the eyes of a single reader, allowing others to hear phrases even when their own reading ability was limited. Still, hearing respected words was not the same as gaining full access to schooling. The boundary between oral and written culture remained porous, but paper, instruction, and leisure were never evenly shared. The pupil's copybook waited while he completed a task. Its paper held rows of characters, some dark and balanced, others crowded or faint. A teacher's model might stand near the top. The child had tried to follow it, reproducing not only the components of each character, but the movement that joined them. At home, the copybook became a visible record of time. An elder could examine it, praise improvement, notice carelessness, or simply nod before returning to another concern. In a family with its own educated members, correction might continue after school. In a family newly approaching literacy, the master's marks could carry more authority because few at home were able to judge the finer points. Books themselves moved through household economies. A printed volume might be treasured, repaired, wrapped, stored above damp floors, and passed between generations. A family with fewer books could borrow or copy. Commercial printing had made texts available on a scale earlier ages had not known, especially in prosperous regions and towns, but availability still did not mean equal ownership. Cheap and costly editions existed beside manuscripts and fragments. A child might encounter primers, moral texts, practical almanacs, religious writings, popular stories, or examination materials according to the world around him. The official prestige of the classics was immense, yet lived reading was broader, messier, and more varied than an ideal curriculum suggested. By late afternoon, another errand could lead toward the market. Stalls were beginning to change their display as the light lowered. A shopkeeper tied a bundle. Someone counted small items and made a mark in a book. The pupil noticed the brush without needing to stop. Its movement resembled the master's brush and yet served a different purpose, recording goods rather than commenting on an ancient passage. Literacy joined lofty aspiration to everyday administration. The same writing system appeared on learned pages, medicine packets, account books, signs, letters, and ritual objects. Mastery came by degrees, and most people who used writing did so far below the polished level celebrated in examination essays. The road home lengthened in the slanting light. Children who had spent the day in labor passed children who had attended lessons, and sometimes the same child belonged to both groups within a single day. Their clothing, nourishment, family expectations, and future possibilities could differ sharply. Still, evening gathered them into a common softness. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Doorways warmed with lamplight. A dog settled against a wall. The fields beyond the houses lost their fine detail and became broad shapes of brown, green, or silver, according to season. The day's distinctions remained real, but the descending light covered them with the same patient dusk. For some pupils, schooling stopped when the household judged that enough had been learned or too much labor had been lost. The end might not have been marked by ceremony. A boy simply appeared less often, then no longer came, because he was needed in a shop, on land, at a craft, or on journeys connected to family business. His knowledge did not vanish. Characters remained in memory, though some faded without practice. A passage repeated hundreds of times might return while he measured grain or waited beside a ferry. Education could be brief and still leave a durable trace. It could also be long and fail to produce the distinction a family had hoped for. For another pupil, continued study became possible through a combination of means, encouragement, kinship, and reputation. His chores did not necessarily disappear, but others absorbed more of them. New texts arrived. The teacher assigned more demanding passages. The household began to speak of examinations, perhaps cautiously, perhaps with hope. That hope had material weight. More paper would be needed, more years supported, more journeys considered, and more uncertainty accepted. The image of success could inspire a family, yet the actual path narrowed as it continued. Most children who touched the first pages of classical learning would not walk to its highest official destinations. This was the quiet bargain beneath the school day. Time at the desk could open useful skills, social respect, moral aspiration, or the distant possibility of advancement. It also rested upon food, labor, gendered expectations, local opportunity, and the willingness of a household to wait for returns that might never come. The ideal said that diligent study refined the person. Daily life answered that the person still needed supper, shoes, light, paper, and someone to finish the unattended task. Both truths belonged together. Removing either one would make the schoolroom too grand or the household too narrow. As evening deepened, the pupil washed the dust from his hands. Ink stains remained faintly near a fingernail, a dark reminder of the morning's work. The family meal gathered whatever the household could provide into bowls and shared dishes. Voices moved gently around practical matters, perhaps the weather, a relative's health, tomorrow's labor, or the condition of a tool. The child listened and ate. If an elder asked about the lesson, he repeated a line. If no one asked, the line remained inside him, resting beside the sounds of chopsticks, the scrape of a stool, and the low breath of the cooking fire. Beyond the gate, the way to school had become dim. The stones that held heat at noon now cooled under the evening air. Tomorrow, or on another day when work allowed, feet would cross them again. A small bundle of books would travel from household to school and back, carrying the ambitions of more than one person. Yet tonight there was no need to decide how far that journey would reach. The basket had been emptied, the errand completed, the meal finished, and the copybook placed where it would remain dry. There is no hurry at all as we leave the household and follow the faint smell of ink toward the longer shadow cast by the examinations. For now, let the village path grow quiet beneath the roofs. Let the last warm steam disappear above the bowls, and let the pupils' footsteps fade into the courtyard, slow, familiar, and soft. Beyond the household table and the quiet errands of the day, another presence waited at the edge of education. It did not wait like a person at a gate, and it did not enter every child's life in the same way. It was more like the shadow of a tall building falling across several smaller courtyards, reaching people who would never step inside the building itself. This was the civil service examination system, a long-established structure that connected classical learning with official rank and shaped educational ambition through much of late Imperial China. Its influence was wide, but participation at its higher levels was narrow. To understand a schoolboy's copybook, it helps to feel both the reach of that shadow and the great distance between first lessons and final success. In many schools, the texts chosen for study reflected the authority of the Confucian classical tradition and recognized commentary. Children began far below the level expected of advanced candidates, yet their early literacy could still be directed toward a curriculum whose upper reaches led toward examinations. A short passage copied in a village school and a polished essay produced by an experienced candidate belonged to very different stages of learning. They were nevertheless connected by an educational ideal that valued command of revered texts, disciplined composition, and the moral language associated with government and cultivated life. This connection helped give local lessons a horizon beyond the schoolroom, even when few pupils traveled very far toward it. The system had developed over many centuries and changed across dynasties. By the Ming and Qing periods that frame much of our composite episode, examinations formed a prominent route into the world of officials and degree holders, though rules, practices, and institutional details did not remain perfectly fixed. It is better to imagine a layered tradition than a machine that operated identically in every decade and place. The state defined recognized forms of learning. Local teachers prepared students within varied circumstances. Families interpreted the promise of advancement according to their resources. Candidates encountered successive levels of assessment and competition. Around all of them grew a culture of books, models, advice, anxiety, perseverance, and patient waiting. The ideal was powerful because it claimed that learning and demonstrated ability mattered. In principle, a boy not born into an official family might study, succeed in examinations, and enter the educated elite. Stories of remarkable advancement gave this principle human form. Families could point to men whose origins seemed modest beside their later distinction. Moralists could praise effort rather than inheritance. The state could present its officials as men selected through mastery rather than merely through birth. Yet lived access was never equal. Years of preparation required support: books, teachers, health, time, travel, and freedom from labor that many households could not provide. The door was not sealed by hereditary rank alone, but neither did it stand equally open to everyone. Our composite pupil had once copied his first characters while listening to brushes move across paper. Now imagine that he continued beyond those beginnings. His books multiplied gradually. The passages grew longer. A teacher's explanation joined memorized words to layers of commentary. A character no longer stood by itself as a shape to reproduce. It belonged to a sentence, an argument, a moral example, and a tradition of interpretation. The pupil listened while the master's steady voice placed one phrase beside another. Afternoon light moved across the table. Dust settled on the edge of a closed volume. Outside, someone crossed the courtyard carrying water, and the long work of learning continued without spectacle. Memorization played an important part in many paths of classical education, but it was not simply the empty storage of sounds. Recitation gave the student a body of language that could later be explained, compared, and used in writing. At the earliest stage, meaning might remain partial. With continued study, the teacher drew attention to structure, proper interpretation, historical example, and accepted commentary. The ideal candidate was expected to do more than recognize familiar lines. He had to handle them within demanding forms and demonstrate cultivated judgment. Exactly how teachers balanced recitation, explanation, composition, and correction varied. The rhythm of repeated reading remained one of the quiet bridges between childhood lessons and advanced study. Writing for examination culture also required control of the brush. Calligraphy carried practical and aesthetic significance, and a clear, disciplined hand could be part of a student's preparation. Yet one should not turn every brushstroke into a direct rehearsal for office. Children wrote for many reasons, and styles of instruction differed. Still, the physical habits mattered. The posture at the desk, the measured loading of ink, the pressure that made a line broaden or thin, and the spacing that kept characters distinct all trained patience. A candidate's ideas had to reach paper through a tired hand. Long before any formal test, the brush had become an instrument through which knowledge, composure, and presentation met. At home, examination ambition might first appear in very ordinary forms. A relative preserved an old text instead of selling it. A lamp remained lit while a young man studied. A family rearranged labor so he could attend a teacher. A more prosperous lineage supported a school or offered help to promising members. A patron noticed ability. None of these arrangements guaranteed progress, and not every family pursued them. Yet the examination horizon could organize sacrifice. Grain, cloth, earnings, and time were converted indirectly into pages read and essays corrected. The hoped-for reward might lie years away, uncertain and available to only a fraction of those who began. The candidate's journey was made of thresholds. Lower assessments and local recognition stood before higher examinations connected to larger administrative centers, while the most prestigious degrees lay at the far end of a severe process. The exact terminology and procedures can be left resting in the historian's reference books tonight. What matters for our quiet walk is the narrowing. At each stage, many prepared and fewer advanced. Success could bring status even below the highest level, and degree holders often became influential in local society or found roles connected to teaching and community leadership. Failure, meanwhile, did not always end study at once. Some men tried repeatedly, taught others, managed family affairs, or carried scholarly identity without achieving the office they had imagined. Waiting became part of the culture surrounding examinations. Books were gathered, journeys planned, lodging arranged, and news anticipated. Seasons passed between efforts. In a scholar's room, preparation could seem almost still from the outside. A man sat beneath a lamp, turned pages, composed, revised, and read again. Yet the household around him felt the passage of time. Parents aged. Children grew. Money moved outward. Duties waited. The candidate's concentration was supported by an invisible circle of labor, just as the younger pupil's school day had been. The higher the ambition reached, the longer that support might be required. We do not need to enter a cramped examination cell or dwell on bodily strain to understand the seriousness of the process. Such details can easily sharpen the story when our purpose is to let it soften. Instead, remain in the preparation room. The desk was broad enough for paper and a few carefully arranged objects. A low flame gathered amber light around the page. Beyond it, shelves and walls receded into darkness. The candidate reviewed a passage he had known for years, noticing how familiar words could still demand exact attention. The night held no sudden revelation. It held only the steady return of the mind to the text. Official educational ideals placed moral cultivation close to administrative worthiness. The person who understood proper relationships, ritual order, historical precedent, and the classics was imagined as better prepared to serve. The scholar official represented this union of learning and governance. In practice, passing an examination did not guarantee wisdom, kindness, or effective administration, just as failing did not prove their absence. Institutions produced both ideals and imperfect outcomes. Connections, wealth, regional opportunity, and family background continued to matter. The prestige of the degree remained real, while the human beings who pursued and held it remained varied. The examination system also helped spread a shared language of aspiration. A teacher in one locality and a student in another could orient themselves toward respected texts and recognized forms, even though accents, resources, and school conditions differed. Printed guides, model essays, commentaries, and other study materials circulated within this world. The result was not perfect uniformity. Local traditions and individual teachers shaped learning, and access to good editions or expert instruction was unequal. Still, the distant state reached into small rooms through the curriculum. Authority appeared not as a visiting official, but as a line selected for memorization, a model placed before a brush, or a standard against which an essay was judged. For most schoolboys, however, the shadow was longer than the road they traveled. Many ended schooling after gaining a limited degree of literacy. Others studied further, but never entered serious examination competition. Some lived where instruction was irregular or resources slight. Some families chose practical work over uncertain ambition. The fact that the curriculum pointed toward examinations did not mean that every pupil became a candidate, just as a road sign does not mean every passerby follows the road to its end. The first pages could still be useful and valued. They belonged to a wider written culture without promising a place in government. This distinction matters because later memory often favors the successful. Biographies preserve the man who rose, genealogies honor the degree holder, and paintings present cultivated gatherings with graceful calm. The child who learned enough to keep accounts and then worked quietly for decades left fewer traces. The repeated candidate who never achieved high distinction may survive as a family story or a line in a local record, if he survives at all. The girl who read at home without public recognition may be almost invisible unless her writing was preserved. Historical silence gathers around ordinary education, so our narration must remain gentle in its claims as well as its tone. Imagine the pupil listening while an older student practiced a composition. The younger boy did not understand every reference. He noticed instead the pacing of the voice, the way one section balanced another, and the pause while the teacher considered a phrase. A brush rested across the inkstone. The older student's sleeve brushed the table. Correction came without drama, a few marks and a low explanation. For the child, examination culture was not yet a formal sequence of ranks. It was an atmosphere, a sense that certain books led onward, that certain ways of writing mattered, and that adults measured progress against a horizon he could barely see. At home, the horizon took different shapes for different relatives. One elder might dream of honor for the lineage. Another might calculate the cost. A mother could support the student's work while also seeing the years of uncertainty more clearly than those who spoke only of success. A sibling might take on tasks he no longer performed. Family encouragement and family pressure could occupy the same room, though surviving ideals often praised harmonious dedication. We need not invent a particular conversation. It is enough to understand that aspiration was collective. A candidate carried a personal brush, but the hand behind it was steadied by many others. Success at a recognized level could alter how a man stood within local society. Degree holders might receive respect, assume leadership, teach, advise, build networks, or become eligible for further opportunity. The highest success could lead toward appointment and participation in imperial administration, though advancement and office were not automatic in every case. A scholar official's life then moved between texts and practical governance, ideals and compromise, home region and assigned responsibilities. The painted image of a refined man among books concealed paperwork, relationships, judgment, and the uneven realities of state service. Even at the summit, learning did not free a person from ordinary complexity. Those who did not pass could remain woven into educational life. A man with years of study possessed knowledge that could be taught, copied, explained, or used in local affairs. Some teachers were themselves products of the examination world without holding its highest honors. Their tables carried the residue of ambition into the next generation. They corrected boys whose futures would branch in many directions. In this way, unsuccessful or partial journeys still sustained the system. The examination shadow was cast not only by officials in distant halls, but by local scholars who had spent long evenings with the classics and then opened books for others. The promise of mobility should therefore be held with two hands. In one hand rested a genuine possibility that distinguished the system from a strictly hereditary order. Men from families without recent official rank could sometimes rise through study and examination, and such examples carried enormous cultural force. In the other hand rested the unequal distribution of preparation. Wealth, male privilege, location, family literacy, patronage, and years free for study shaped who could become competitive. A principle of selection by learning existed, yet it operated inside a society already marked by hierarchy. The two truths do not cancel each other. They make the past more complete. For girls and women, the examination horizon was different. Their educational opportunities were generally more restricted, and the regular official ladder did not invite them upward as candidates. Some learned within households and became accomplished readers or writers. A few were celebrated for literary talent, while many more used literacy in private or left little recoverable record. Their study could be encouraged as moral refinement, family instruction, literary culture, or practical household ability, according to setting. But it did not usually open the same institutional route. The lamp beside a woman's book and the lamp beside a male candidate's classics could cast similar light while illuminating very different futures. As the years passed, a serious student's shelves acquired layers. Early primers remained below commentaries. Model compositions gathered beside paper waiting for practice. Notes accumulated in margins or on separate sheets. Books carried signs of use. Softened corners, repaired bindings, faint stains, and places where fingers had returned many times. Not every student owned such a collection. Some relied on borrowed or shared texts. In a prosperous study, abundance could surround the reader. In a modest room, a few volumes could hold equal intensity. The examination culture depended on revered words, but access to the physical vessels of those words remained uneven. There were also rhythms of discouragement too ordinary to become dramatic. A passage refused to settle in memory. A composition returned covered in correction. A friend advanced while another remained behind. Illness interrupted preparation. Money shortened a period of study. These experiences did not need a twist to carry weight. They accumulated slowly, like soot above a lamp. Some students continued. Some changed direction. Some balanced teaching or other work with renewed attempts. The historical record suggests persistence, but it also hints at the many lives reorganized around an aspiration that remained incomplete. Our composite pupil grew older in the quiet span of a few paragraphs. His childish grip became steadier. His voice lowered. The courtyard stones remained while seasons crossed them. He might now help younger boys with the first lines he had once struggled to copy. Whether he became a candidate or simply stood near that world, he understood the examination shadow more clearly. It was made of honor, service, family hope, and genuine intellectual labor. It was also made of expense, selection, waiting, and the knowledge that many diligent people would not reach its highest rooms. One evening, he closed a commentary and listened to the village beyond the wall. A vendor's call had ended. A door moved on its hinge. The brush washer reflected a small flame. He did not need to picture the imperial capital in bright detail. The state was already present in the page before him, in the approved tradition he studied, and the form toward which his teacher guided him. Yet beside the page lay the household's plain wooden table, worn smooth by meals and work. The distance between those two worlds could be measured in years, but tonight it was only the width of a hand. The long shadow of the examinations did not darken everything. It gave shape to educational effort and offered some families a language for hope. It preserved and elevated a body of learning. It connected local teachers to an imperial order. At the same time, it could make one narrow kind of achievement appear larger than the many useful lives beyond it. Most pupils would return to trades, farms, households, shops, teaching, clerical work, or paths that records scarcely describe. Their first lessons still mattered, even when no official title followed. Now the books could be stacked without deciding the student's future. The top volume settled against the one beneath it. A thread binding made a faint sound. The lamp flame shortened as oil was consumed, and the room beyond its circle grew calm. Outside, the examination road extended through county walls, regional centers, and imagined halls of power, but there was no need to travel it tonight. There is no hurry at all as that distant road fades. We can remain beside the stack of classics and follow only the low amber light. Soon it will lead us back to the courtyard where the day began, to the water jar, the cooling stones, and the inkstone waiting in silence. The candidate's page rests. The household breathes. The tall shadow loosens into night. The lamp beside the classics burned with a small and patient flame. It did not illuminate the whole room, and it did not need to. Its amber circle held a folded cloth, the dark surface of an inkstone, the pale edges of paper, and the lower part of a wooden shelf. Beyond that circle, familiar objects rested in shadow. A stool waited beneath the table. A brush hung with its hairs pointing downward. The wall kept the memory of the day's warmth, while cooler air gathered near the door. This final room, like the school and household we have visited, is a careful composite of late imperial life, an imagined place built from plausible details rather than the record of one exact evening. It asks only that we sit quietly and watch the day come to rest. The student had returned to his books after the meal. He might have been a boy reviewing a lesson, an older candidate continuing years of study, or a family member reading for purposes that did not lead toward an examination. Across late Imperial China, household study took many forms, and lamplight fell on many kinds of pages. Some rooms belonged to prosperous scholarly families with collections and space. Others held only a few treasured texts beside tools, storage chests, and the ordinary furniture of domestic life. Some readers had teachers and educated relatives close at hand. Others worked with limited guidance. Tonight, these differences remain present, though the darkness makes the boundaries between rooms feel soft. He opened the volume without urgency. Thread-bound leaves settled beneath his fingers. Editions, paper quality, formats, and bindings varied, so we will not insist on one universal book. The page before him was simply used and cared for. Its printed characters stood in ordered lines. A small repair strengthened one edge. Somewhere earlier, a reader had left a faint mark that might have guided later attention. Books could be bought, inherited, borrowed, copied, or shared. Each method carried its own history of hands. The student touched only the margin, preserving the written surface as best he could, and allowed his eyes to return to a passage already familiar. Familiarity was not the same as completion. Classical study invited repetition, commentary, comparison, and renewed effort. A line learned in childhood could acquire further shades of meaning under another teacher or at another age. Accepted interpretations guided examination preparation, while personal reflection could still gather quietly around the words. The student read in a low voice. Sound and sight supported one another. Each phrase rose just above silence and then descended into it again, leaving the room almost unchanged. Outside, night insects or distant human movement formed a thin background, different according to season and region, and gentler here than the day's full activity. The lamp required care. Depending on place and means, a household might have used different fuels and lamp forms, and there is no reason to choose one design for every home. What mattered was the modest pool of light and the resources consumed to sustain it. Study after dark was never entirely abstract. It used oil or another fuel. It required a wick, a vessel, and attention. A family that allowed the flame to continue was giving material support to the reader, just as it had given food, paper, and hours. The ideal of tireless learning often praised the individual, but the lamp reminded us that endurance rested on household provision. Stories about devoted scholars sometimes turn night study into a bright emblem of perseverance. Such tales could inspire, instruct, or simplify. Lived evenings were quieter. Eyes grew tired. Smoke could trouble the air. Fingers cooled in one season and felt sticky in another. A reader lost his place, rubbed his brow, and began the line again. He was not a symbol while sitting there. He was a person within a body, supported by a chair, a table, food already eaten, and other people sleeping or working nearby. The distance between ideal diligence and ordinary fatigue was measured in the slow lowering of his shoulders. He reached for the inkstick and then paused. No further writing was necessary yet. The inkstone still held a faint dark sheen from earlier work. In the morning courtyard, we had heard the patient sound of ink being ground with water, a soft circular movement that prepared thought before thought became visible. Now the stone was nearly still. A trace of black gathered in its shallow well. The lamp touched that surface and made a point of reflected gold, a night-colored echo of the pale sky that had rested in the courtyard water jar before lessons began. The school day had opened with doors, broom strokes, cool stones, and the first small preparation of materials. It had passed through copied characters, the master's measured reading, warm food, household errands, village paths, and the distant promise of examinations. None of those things stood alone. The brush depended on paper. The lesson depended on labor. The candidate depended on family. The official ideal depended on teachers in uncelebrated rooms. Even the courtyard depended on someone who swept it before pupils arrived. Education appeared in books, but it lived through networks of care, work, authority, hope, and unequal opportunity. In the last hours of the day, those networks became easier to hear because fewer people spoke. From another room came the sound of fabric being folded. A lid settled onto a container. Someone checked a door and lowered a bar. A younger child shifted beneath bedding. Perhaps an elder coughed once and became still. The student continued reading, though not everyone under the roof could have followed the text. Literacy within households varied by age, gender, opportunity, and purpose. Some knew classical writings. Some read practical documents. Some recognized only a small group of useful characters. Some relied on others to turn written words into sound. A woman in the household might have learned enough to read the page beside him, or she might have possessed a literary education of her own. In other homes, such instruction would have been unavailable. Women's opportunities were generally narrower than men's, and the official examination route was not arranged for them in the usual way. Still, the surviving writings of educated women remind us that the boundary was restrictive rather than absolute. Mothers, daughters, wives, and sisters could take part in household literary culture, teach children, exchange letters, compose, copy, or read. The record reveals some of these lives and leaves many others in shadow. The student turned a leaf. The sound was dry, light, and brief. He did not hurry toward the end of the volume. Reading could be cyclical, returning to known passages instead of advancing only toward novelty. The structure suited a slow evening. A sentence was read, remembered, and allowed to rest beside another sentence learned years before. Commentary connected them. A teacher's explanation returned in memory with the shape of his voice. The old schoolroom entered the household study, not as a complete picture, but as a rhythm carried inward by repetition. If the reader was preparing for examinations, the page also carried institutional weight. Recognized classics and commentaries stood at the center of the examination tradition, and advanced candidates worked within demanding expectations of interpretation and composition. Yet tonight the machinery of assessment remained far away. No result was posted. No rank was announced. The reader had only the present line and the flame beside it. The calm was not meant to deny competition or inequality. It simply placed them at a distance where they could be understood without becoming loud. If the reader was not a candidate, the same lamp could serve another relation to text. He might review a family record, copy a letter, read a moral instruction, examine an account, or enjoy writing beyond the official curriculum. Written culture in late Imperial China was not contained entirely by the state examinations, even though they gave classical learning extraordinary prestige. Commercial printing, local institutions, religious practice, household administration, lineage activity, and literary pleasure all helped pages circulate. The book beside the lamp could therefore open toward government, family, devotion, livelihood, memory, or art. The hand that held the page had learned many motions during the day. It had guided a brush, lifted a bowl, carried a basket, opened a gate, and perhaps steadied a younger child. Scholarly identity could be represented as withdrawal from manual tasks, but daily life often brought kinds of work together. Even in an elite household where servants performed much labor, bodies and objects still required care. The reader's sleeve had to be mended. The table had to be wiped. The lamp had to be filled. Material life persisted beneath the elevated language of self-cultivation. This was true of the teacher as well. After pupils left, he did not remain forever seated in the posture of instruction. He sorted papers, protected books from damp, discussed household matters, visited neighbors, or completed any number of tasks that records rarely describe. His authority in the classroom was one part of his social position, not the whole of his humanity. Some teachers possessed degrees or examination experience. Others followed different routes into instruction. Their learning, skill, patience, and circumstances varied. The ideal master at the table had been a useful guide, but no single portrait could contain them all. The school itself changed after dark. Benches became shapes. The master's table lost the sharpness of its edges. The water jar reflected no clear sky, only a dim piece of the eve and, perhaps, a small point of lamplight from a nearby room. Stone slabs released the warmth they had gathered. A leaf crossed the courtyard when air moved beneath the gate. The place that had carried many reciting voices now held them only as memory. Their phrases seemed absorbed into wood, paper, plaster, and stone, leaving the silence deeper but not empty. Tomorrow, attendance would still depend on circumstance. One pupil would return early. Another would arrive after an errand. Another might be absent because the household required labor. A child who had studied for a few seasons could leave and not return. A fortunate and determined student might continue through years of increasingly specialized work. These futures did not need to be resolved in our final scene. History contained all of them. The classroom was not a single road, but a meeting place from which lives separated quietly. The ideal of education promised cultivation through texts, disciplined habits, and proper conduct. It could give meaning to effort and connect a small room to a tradition older than anyone inside it. Lived experience placed that ideal among fatigue, limited means, uneven teachers, family needs, gender restrictions, and the unpredictable turns of health and fortune. The ideal was neither meaningless nor complete. It shaped real choices, while real conditions reshaped it in return. At the lamplit table, both could be held together without forcing one to disappear. Our student lowered his eyes once more. In the margin between light and shadow, the page seemed almost cream-colored. Black characters held steady while the flame moved. Ink and paper offered a strong contrast, yet each depended on subtle gradations. A stroke began with pressure, traveled, and lifted. Empty space gave the character form. The written line itself became a quiet lesson in balance, a visual order made from dark marks and untouched paper. He followed it slowly, not seeking surprise, only steadiness. Beyond the wall, the larger empire rested unevenly across mountains, plains, river valleys, coasts, towns, and remote settlements. No single school day could represent such scale. Late Imperial China contained regional difference, local custom, wealth and poverty, crowded centers of printing, and places where books were scarce. The composite courtyard gave us an entrance, not a complete map. It allowed the brush to become audible and the stone to feel cool beneath imagined feet. The limits of that image are part of its honesty. The student's family had gone quiet. Perhaps one person remained awake nearby, repairing cloth or finishing an account. The two lamps, if there were two, would have made separate islands of labor. Classical study occupied one island, domestic work another, though their resources flowed together. The reader could not rise toward distinction without the largely unrecorded work around him. The person sewing or counting could not be reduced to support alone, for that life held its own knowledge and purpose. In the softened room, history widened beyond the name most likely to appear in a document. He closed the book for a moment and placed both hands on the table. The wood was smooth where many wrists had rested. A tiny roughness remained near one corner. Objects preserve use without explaining it. A worn desk does not tell us who succeeded, who abandoned study, who resented the lesson, or who discovered pleasure in a line of poetry. It only tells us that hands returned. The absence of complete testimony invites care. Where evidence grows thin, certainty should grow thin with it. The lamp flame leaned and straightened. Its movement drew the eye away from the page toward the brush. Cleaned after use, the brush had been hung so its hairs could dry, a practice familiar in many settings though household habits differed. A final bead of moisture clung near the tip and then disappeared. The inkstone, more durable than brush or paper, could accompany years of study. It might be plain or finely made, inexpensive or treasured. Tonight it was simply dark, cool, and almost dry. In the courtyard, the water jar answered the inkstone. One held clear water for daily use. The other had received a little water and turned it dark with ink. At dawn, each had participated in preparation. At night, each became still. The circle of the episode closed not through a sudden lesson, but through these resting surfaces. Water, stone, and ink had carried us from blank paper into written tradition, from private effort toward public aspiration, and back again into quiet household life. The student opened the book one final time, not to begin a new section, but to confirm the place where tomorrow's reading might resume. He adjusted a marker or remembered the page, depending on habit. The volume closed with a muted meeting of paper and cover. He placed it on the stack, aligning the edge with care. Another book rested beneath it, then another. The classics no longer needed to speak. Their authority remained, but the room was permitted to become only a room again. He covered the inkstone or set it safely aside. He checked that the brush was secure. Such small actions belong to the conservation of scarce and valued materials. Paper left exposed could gather damp or dust. Books could suffer insects, careless handling, smoke, and weather. Families protected them according to their means and knowledge. A collection represented money, labor, inheritance, and identity. Even a few pages deserve care because replacing them might not be easy. The last work of the day was therefore a work of putting away. The stool moved beneath the table. Loose paper was gathered. A cloth passed over one surface. The lamp was carried or lowered. Each action reduced the visible world by a little. First the shelves disappeared, then the far wall, then the edge of the table. At last only the flame and the hand near it remained. The student paused long enough to let his eyes soften. When the light went out, darkness did not arrive as an interruption. It completed the room. A faint thread of smoke rose and thinned. From the courtyard came the cooling scent of stone and water. The pupil, the older candidate, the teacher, the sister reading at home, and the relatives whose labor supported them all receded into the broad night of the past. Their experiences had never been identical. We leave them without pressing those differences into a single tidy picture. The courtyard before lessons was waiting once again. In a few hours, someone might lift a broom. A door might open. Water might be poured into the inkstone, and the first circular sound of grinding would begin. But the future morning did not need to arrive yet. The jar remained dark beneath the eaves. The brushes hung motionless. The stone path rested, pale only where a little moonlight reached it. Let the examination halls remain distant. Let the household accounts stay closed. Let every unfinished copybook wait without concern. The characters learned today have settled into memory as softly as soot above the lamp. Some will be recalled, some forgotten, some used in ways no teacher could predict. Nothing more is required of the page tonight. Our walk through the school day has returned to its beginning, to wood, water, stone, and ink. The early courtyard that welcomed us before dawn now holds the deep blue of night. No voices remain in recitation. No footsteps cross the threshold. There is only the quiet after study, the gentle darkness around the empty desks, and the faint remembered circle of the inkstick moving across stone. Rest now beside that fading sound. Let the courtyard grow softer. Let the last amber light disappear from the paper, and let the long history of learning drift beyond the edge of sleep. Thank you for spending the night in history with me. I'm the Yawning Historian.